Ladies and gentlemen, guests and supporters of the Václav Havel Library, Czech radio listeners, good evening. Welcome to the keynote address of the conference Borders of Unfreedom. My role tonight is to introduce the main speaker, Timothy Snyder. Custom demands that I stress his extraordinary professional credentials. He comes to us from Yale University, where he serves as the Levin Professor of History and teaches courses on Eastern Europe and political atrocity. His books, such as Bloodlands, Black Earth, The Road to Unfreedom, and On Tyranny, have been translated into 40 languages. They represent not only works of history, but fundamental contributions to our understanding of freedom. His investigations of fascism in 20th century Europe alert us to the fragility of Western liberal democracy, guide us to recognize early warnings, and impel us to stand guard. They have earned Professor Snyder the Literature Award of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Václav Havel Foundation Prize, the Hannah Arendt Prize, the Leipzig Award, several state orders, and countless other distinctions. I hope that you and Professor Snyder will forgive me for not reproducing the list in its entirety. Instead, I want to depart from custom and introduce him through one of his thoughts, an idea that resonates with me in a particularly powerful way. And this is the idea that when you are free, you find sometimes that there is only one thing you can really do, only one path you can take. I was puzzled when I first heard Professor Snyder say this. It was at a conference 2 years ago, and he was discussing Volodymyr Zelensky's key decision to remain in Kiev during the initial phase of the Russian invasion in February 2022. Intuitively, the argument made sense. Zelensky had no choice. As a free person, he had to stay put. Fleeing would have turned him into a slave of Vladimir Putin. He would have surrendered his agency to the Russian dictator. Still, for 2 decades, I have been teaching university students that the heart of liberal political philosophy lies in a different notion of freedom. When you are free, you have the right to do and say whatever you please without arbitrary constraints, provided only that you do not infringe on others' freedoms. But it did not take long for the seed planted in my mind by Professor Snyder to take root. I only had to give it a bit of fresh soil, a bit of space unclouded by John Locke, John Stuart Mill, America's founding fathers, and the rest of the Western liberal canon. Once I had done this, the seed sprouted and started growing. Is it not the case that the moment we come of age and reach adulthood, life begins to gnaw at the foundations of our character and identity? We find ourselves exposed to relentless erosion. It strips us of those who had formed us. Our grandparents pass away, then our parents, coaches, school teachers. It levels the places we were raised. Not a trace remains of the army barracks that once surrounded the house I was born. It subjects us to the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, to quote Shakespeare, to cruel jokes, as Kundera would put it, to the terror of history, to use Mircea Eliade's term. It may even come to steal our country in the middle of the night. It corrupts our language, our ideals, our sincerity. To gain power and status, we learn to ape empty phrases like Hugo Pludek does in Václav Havel's Garden Party. In the end, we may reach a point where nothing remains of us. Listen, who are you in fact? Hugo's father asks him at the end of the garden party. Me? You mean who I am? Hugo responds, now look here, I don't like this one-sided way of putting questions. He doesn't, because he no longer has a clear answer. He has lost his identity. And that, I feel, is precisely what Timothy Snyder means by his idea of freedom. He he means the same thing as Václav Havel did when talking about living in truth. Sometimes, among the many courses of action we can take, there is only one that will enable us to remain true to ourselves. It may not be the easiest one, or most profitable, or safest. Indeed, it may get us fired from a job, turn us into outcasts, land us in prison, or even get us killed. But we must choose it anyway, for choosing anything else would make us unrecognizable to ourselves. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Timothy Snyder, who will deliver a lecture on Havel.
So my idea this evening is that freedom has everything to do with unpredictability. And I believe that Milan Babic got us off to a good start. I was very happy not to have my books listed. That would have been very predictable. That is what always happens. I'm much happier to listen to Milan think. And my invitation to you is that we all do the same for the next 45 minutes or so during this lecture, because what I'll be inviting you to do is to think along with me. There is no text. I'm not 100% sure that these ideas are right. What I do think, though, is that our set idea of freedom is mistaken, and that the way to repair it has something to do with acknowledging our own very special human capacity, which is for unpredictability. I will pick up where Milan left off. There's a reason why I happened to mention at the conference he organized in Maine a couple of years ago, Zelensky and his decision to stay. It was, as Milan quite rightly says, an example of freedom in the sense of being yourself. The notion of freedom here is that you make choices over the course of a life, becoming the ethical character who you are, and then when confronted by a certain conjuncture of circumstances, you see that there is only one choice which allows you to remain that ethical person, which allows you to retain that character. But there's another dimension to this story, which has to do with freedom and predictability. And that is that I know that what Zelensky did, at least in my part of the world, was unpredictable because everyone predicted the opposite. In fact, this was very troubling for me in February of 2022 as an American in the United States. I found myself essentially alone saying, no, I believe, in fact, the Ukrainian president will not flee his country. 4 days before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, I happened to be in a classroom. Behind me, on a giant screen like this one, were 6 foreign policy advisors, 3 from the Trump administration, 3 from the previous Obama administration. All 6 of them very politely said that I was wrong. Of course Zelensky would flee. Of course Ukraine would collapse in a matter of days. This is what was predicted by the finest, most expert minds of the single superpower in the world. And yet they were wrong. Why were they wrong? I think it has to do with a problem, as Milan has already suggested, in our American, or for you Russians out there, Anglo-Saxon or Western idea of freedom, an idea of freedom which depends far too much on the notion that the world is going to be there for us, providing us the things we need to be free. I fear to say it, but I will. I think the reason why everyone in Washington, D.C. believed that Zelensky would run away is because they simply couldn't imagine doing anything else themselves. And when we're this impoverished, when we don't have a notion of freedom as defending something that matters, there must be a basic problem in our understanding of freedom as such. That's where I want to begin. I come from a country where we speak about freedom all the time. And I fear that in so doing, we've contributed more than our share to making the word and the concept meaningless. I fear that what we have done is we've made it mean whatever we want it to mean at a particular moment. What I want to do together with you is actually take it seriously, and as Milan quite rightly, in this case, predicted, in the spirit of Václav Havel. What I have in mind by freedom is something much more like the restlessness of transcendence, the adventure of novelty, the rebellion against the status quo, to quote Havel. The argument I want to make, and this is not necessarily about running politics, it's not necessarily about what's happening right now, but I think in a deeper sense, it explains a lot about where we are. The argument I want to make is that we have been trapped by a kind of cult of rationality, that we have a story about ourselves which is fundamentally not true and self-delusive, which allows us to believe that we are free. In a couple of sentences, it goes like this. In the distant past, people were irrational. They did fundamentally irrational things. They sacrificed animals to gods. They sacrificed their children to gods. They went to oracles in order to collect wisdom or guidance about what they were going to do. But we, enlightened people, secular people, are beyond all of this. We are rational. I think that is precisely where we've gone wrong. I don't think that is correct. And I actually want to try to make this argument in a fairly serious historical way. What I want to suggest is that many of our behaviors now, in the 21st century, are uncomfortably like the things that we would call irrational. So let's think about why, in an earlier point in time, here in Bohemia or elsewhere, why did people make sacrifices to the gods? Why did people consult oracles? What were they doing? They were trying to deal with the cosmic unpredictability of the world around them. You consult oracles or you sacrifice animals because you don't know what the weather is going to be like. You don't know what the climate's going to be like. You consult oracles or you sacrifice animals because you're about to go into battle. You might be killed. You don't know how the battle is going to turn out. And so you involve yourself. You ask for help from someone who you believe will know. Now, I want to dwell for a moment on this idea of an oracle, which, by the way, thank you to the translators out there, because I know that in advance you had no idea what I was going to say. And this is not going to be an easy evening for you. And unpredictability is not good for everyone all the time. So, děkuji vám. Já jsem řekl 2 slova. Tohle vůbec nic. Okay. Okay, apparently some of you are here for Pan-Slavic Comedy Hour. Terrific. So, what I was just doing was giving the translators like 2 minutes of a break. Now you have to start working again. So, but let's think seriously about what it means to consult an oracle. When you consult an oracle, you come with a question that you think is very special to you. But you're going to someone who hears these questions all the time, the same questions over and over and over again. Should I fight this battle? Should I plant this crop? Should I marry this woman? What should I do with my life? And the oracle is very familiar with the kinds of questions that people are going to ask. Moreover, the oracle, in hearing your question, is learning something about you. It's what you fear, what you need, perhaps something which is very intimate. The oracle, like a Catholic priest in confession, is in some way spying on you, collecting information, retaining information. Keep that in mind. Now let's think for a moment of the logic of sacrifice. Like the oracle, the sacrifice is very attractive. Why? Because sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It's like many things we experience, like gambling. I'm sure none of you bet on the European Cup, but things are attractive because sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. Sometimes what the oracle says works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you make a sacrifice and you win the battle, sometimes you don't. And it's that sometimes yes, sometimes no, which is addictive to us, which is attractive to us. But with a sacrifice, there's another step beyond consulting the oracle, which is that you're giving away something dear to you. You may be sacrificing an animal, that would be very valuable. You may be sacrificing a child, that would be even more valuable. And in taking part in a culture of sacrifice, you're recognizing that one day, at least in principle, you might be sacrificed yourself. So when you sacrifice, you're engaging yourself in the most fundamental way, trying to overcome unpredictability, trying to find a way to master the world. Now, of course, why am I talking about all of this? Of course, we live in a very rational world now, right? We're beyond all of this sort of thing, right? We're not doing anything like this now. I think the way that we've gone wrong, or one of the ways that we've gone wrong, is that when we talk about rationality, we are tossing away the metaphysical along with the mythical. And here I'm staying very close to a conversation that Havel had with Michnik not long before Havel's death, that when we claim to be rational, we're tossing away questions about what is valuable and what is good. We're making ourselves comfortable in a conversation about convenience or a conversation about ethics. A conversation about convenience or efficiency, which is about ethics. In other words, when we say rationality, what we have in mind is only means ends rationality. We have in mind what's going to get me from point A to point B. Things are good because they get me to where I want to go. But what, in the end, is actually good, this sort of rationality can never tell you. This sort of rationality can only get you from place to place, but it has nothing to say about the final destination. The other problem with this kind of rationality, or as I'm trying to think of it, this cult of rationality, is that it can be transferred to non-human entities. If rationality, it doesn't involve what you really care about, or what you really care about, or what for you is priceless. If it's just about means and ends, just about getting from here to there, we can let something else do it for us. We can let the market do it for us. We can let the internet do it for us. Indeed, we can imagine to ourselves that markets are more rational than we are, or the internet is more intelligent than we are. Once we accept that rationality is what it's all about, what freedom is all about, we're tempted to give it away. We're tempted to say, aha, something else might be better at this than we are. But where does this then lead us? Where do we then end up if we do this? Let's talk first about the market as an example of this cult of rationality, which I think makes us unfree. We imagine that there's something called a free market. The moment you hear that term, you should stop. A market cannot be free. And I don't mean just practically that there has to be a state to make the laws, even to enforce property rights. I mean metaphysically. A human being can be free. And a human being who decides to call a market free is a human being who's deciding not to be free. The moment that we take that adjective that applies only to us and put it in front of anything else, we are choosing not to be free. The idea that a market can do the thinking for us goes by the name of libertarianism. It's a notion that somehow together, we acting together, we create this abstract market which will do our thinking for us. But, of course, this market, what's so very convenient about it is that it's not going to tell us what's good. That kind of thinking completely disappears. There's a magical thought, which, by the way, was originally a religious thought, that somehow if you're greedy and you're greedy and you're greedy and you're greedy and we're all greedy, somehow that will all be for the greater good. That is, of course, completely nonsense. It's magical thinking, which is very convenient because it licenses us not only not to think about what's good, but to do things that perhaps we know aren't good, while telling ourselves that everything will somehow turn out. And insofar as we don't think about what's good, we're not being free. But let's take the next step, and here I'm going to follow along an argument which is deep in Havel. There was an analysis performed recently about which words Václav Havel used the most. And they weren't words like freedom or unfreedom, although I do get the word unfreedom from him. The words that Havel used the most were words like earth and world. And this is where I want to begin my real critique of the market as a source of rationality. If we start our analysis with Havel and think very concretely about the world and the earth and what the market economy is doing right now to us on this very hot day, what we find ourselves thinking about is globalization in a different sense, the world in a different sense, the earth. Our whole civilization, such as it is, depends upon hydrocarbons, gas, oil. Gas and oil are what we call, sorry, this may not work so well in Czech, but gas and oil are what we call in English fossil fuels. We call them fossil fuels because they are in fact fossils. They are the remnants of living creatures that lived tens of millions of years ago. Which is to say that if we take Havel seriously, and when we think about social relations and the economy, we think about the earth and the world, we realize that every time we drive a car, every time we do anything which burns fossil fuels, we are in fact burning the remains of ancient life. Nothing more, nothing less. Every single time we are burning, or if you care to go along with me a bit further, sacrificing the remains of ancient life. Of course, this being a globalized, abstract, efficient world, we no longer have to observe any particular animal. We no longer have to kill before our own eyes any particular animal. It's millions of living creatures, their remains, which we are burning without thinking of it and without having to see it. When I try to think about what's happening in slightly deeper terms, historical terms, perhaps Havel's terms, how I think about this action, this everyday forgotten action, is the carbon sacrifice. Every day we perform the carbon sacrifice. The fact that we don't know that we're performing the carbon sacrifice doesn't make us more intelligent or more rational than the people who knew they were performing a sacrifice. It may make us less intelligent and less rational than people 1,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago. When we perform the carbon sacrifice, we're not just burning the remains of other creatures who lived millions of years ago, we are also putting what is dear to us, at risk. We're putting our children at risk. We're putting ourselves at risk. We're putting our world, our earth, at risk. The fact that we don't see it as a sacrifice doesn't mean that it's not a sacrifice. And of course, when you perform a sacrifice, you create a god. So I'm sure you all have your favorite Slavic gods. The Czechs are better than most Slavs at remembering all of your nice spirits and your pantheon, and I appreciate that. That's wonderful. One of my favorite Slavic gods is the one that the Eastern Slavs call Volos or Veles. He's responsible for death, and he's also responsible for animals. Now, did Volos or Veles really exist? People made sacrifices to him. Insofar as goats and cattle were killed and sacrificed to him, I would say that far, to that degree, he really did have goats and cattle. We make the gods to whom we sacrifice. Whom are we making gods when we perform the carbon sacrifice? Just like Volos, we're creating entities who would otherwise not be deified. When we perform the carbon sacrifice, we are creating oligarchs, certain kinds of oligarchs, hydrocarbon oligarchs. The most important hydrocarbon oligarch in this part of the world is, of course, Vladimir Putin. Without the carbon sacrifice that we all make, some of us more than others, Putin would not exist. At least he would not exist in the form in which he exists to many people as someone who is beyond the law, beyond the truth, beyond good and evil. Of course, you don't have to have that kind of faith yourself, and I expect that most of you don't. But we all, in performing the carbon sacrifice, make him, in some way, a sort of god of our time. The oligarchs are the pagan gods of our time. And by the way, when I say that, the pagan gods were unreliable, inhuman, treasonous, and murderous. Despite what you learned in the Czech children's books, they were a very nasty group. And so when I speak of the pagans, I want you to keep this in mind. When I speak of today's pagan gods, I don't mean something nice and friendly. I mean something more like that. Who are the American hydrocarbon oligarchs? What do they believe in? The American hydrocarbon oligarchs, the people that Americans create with our carbon sacrifice, are libertarians. They are people who believe that there shouldn't be a government, or it should be dysfunctional, that we should leave all the decisions to somehow this hidden hand of the market. In other words, the circle closes. The circle closes. So that was sacrifice. And what sacrifice leads to is not just the creation of the gods of our time, the evil, treasonous, overpowered gods of our time, who we create with our own actions. It also leads to the situation that I think is crucial to freedom or unfreedom. We are free, I think, when the world around us is more or less predictable, which gives us the possibility to be unpredictable. When the world around us becomes hugely unpredictable, because, for example, climate change leads to new patterns of weather, storms and hurricanes and avalanches and wildfires, when it leads to changes in the whole ecosphere, it's harder for us to be free in that climate of unpredictability. We can't be unpredictable if the world outside is too unpredictable. And that world outside being unpredictable, in a way this is worse, it makes us predictable. Predictably, as the climate gets hotter, we will become shorter tempered, more racist, more likely to compete for resources, more likely to indulge in violence. I'm afraid that is all very predictable. Okay, so much for sacrifice. Let's talk a little bit now about the oracle. So, the question here, I left my phone in my backpack, and because all the research shows that if your phone is close to you, you can't remember anything. Those of you who are in politics might want to keep that in mind. If you actually put your phone away, you can speak longer sentences. But I was going to do a trick now where I held up my phone and I said, "What is this object? And what is it?" I want you to think about that. Like, what in fact is this thing that, I realize you're not American, but if you were American, you would stare at it for 8 hours a day. What is it? Like, what exactly is this thing to which we devote so much of our attention? Well, let's think about it in terms of, I would say, an oracle. Why is it like an oracle? Every time you hold up your iPad or your phone, you're asking it a question, and you think that question is personal to you. But the entity at the other end has heard your question before. For the entity at the other end, it's nothing new, what you're asking about. Okay, I admit, no longer a battle or a crop, but you may still be asking about your relationships. Whatever you're asking the oracle, it's an iteration. The oracle has heard it many times before. And just like an old-fashioned oracle, the thing at the other end of your phone remembers everything that you've asked. It knows all about you. It records everything. It remembers everything. But our modern oracle, our contemporary oracle, is in some way much worse, because our modern oracle, our phone, it doesn't just know how to predict us. It's very good at making us more predictable. It moves us into what Havel called our more probable states. And that's one of my favorite phrases of his, and I think one of the most touching and most important. We have tendencies, let us say, towards impatience or intolerance or a particular kind of racism. Our phones, the algorithms, the networks, pick up those tendencies. Never the things that are best about us, because what's best about us is always unpredictable. But the things that are worst about us, the things that are typical of our demographic. And it finds those things, it reinforces those things, and it moves us towards our more probable states. And the logic of all of this, how it works, is also very much like the way the old-fashioned oracle works. It draws you in because sometimes social media tells you what you want to hear, and then sometimes it makes you really mad, doesn't it? For a while it tells you what you want to hear, and then something is really outrageous, isn't it? It's the same pattern. What makes you happy, what doesn't make you happy. What we've done in the modern world is we've taken the logic of sacrifice, the logic of the oracle. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain. And we've written it into the basic computer codes, which now organize much of your time and much of your cognition and much of your emotion. So I think it's fair to say, just as we have a carbon sacrifice, we also have a digital oracle. I think the best definition of this thing that we all carry around with us now and stare at is a digital oracle. I think it functions much the same way in our lives, but perhaps more intensely than an oracle would have done in a pagan world. And just as the carbon sacrifice throws up gods who have no right to exist, really, so does the digital oracle. As we listen, as we consult the digital oracle, as we listen to the digital oracle, as we spend our time and our money on the digital oracle, we are creating oligarchs who otherwise would not exist. We're throwing up people like Elon Musk who behave very much like pagan gods in their impatience, in their treason, in their certainty of themselves. These people we are creating ourselves. And interestingly enough, these gods too also generally, funny isn't it, believe in libertarianism. Like the hydrocarbon oligarchs, the digital oligarchs also tell us, don't really need a government. I should be able to do what I want to do. Freedom is about the people who have all the money and own social media platforms having even fewer barriers in their lives. That's ultimately what we're being told. And I would submit to you that that's a mistaken idea of freedom, not just in the sense that it's ludicrous to say that one person should determine what everybody else's freedom of speech, which of course is where we are. This lecture is not going to get very many hits on Twitter. Sorry, Czech radio. That's the way the cookie crumbles. But in a deeper sense, and the deeper sense is that the unpredictability of the future, the ways in which all of us should have individual unpredictable futures based upon a mixture of our aspirations and our capabilities, is being hogged. It's being monopolized. It's being taken over by a handful of people who make a parody of it, who make a joke of it with their stupid, impossible ideas of the future, like living forever and going to Mars. The way they behave in public life is a parody of unpredictability. It's exaggerated, it's ridiculous, it's too intense. They're consuming the future for us. They're consuming unpredictability for us and leaving us with nothing. So we perform the carbon sacrifice. We consult the digital oracle. And we do all of this believing that we are rational. And this is why I want to say that it's not rationality, but a cult of rationality. And I don't mean that in any sort of metaphorical sense. I mean quite literally, we are performing a cult which creates costs and generates gods and demigods and heroes of the most old-fashioned, perverse and dangerous kind, and that this is in fact the kind of world we're living in, and that we misdescribe it as rational, but we even more profoundly misdescribe it as free. So what then would freedom be? How then could we be, I'm not going to use the word rational, but reasonable? How would we exercise our specific kind of human reason in order to be free creatures? How do freedom and unpredictability work together? As I've said, I don't mean a cult of rationality where whoever has the microphone or the social platform or the money or is the right age or the right color skin or the right gender says, I'm rational and you're emotional. So much of public discussion consists just of that, the de facto claim of rationality by whoever seems to have the microphone for whatever reason. My emotions are rational, yours are irrational. I don't mean that. And I also don't mean the forms of rationality that I've talked about where we export our reason to abstractions like the market or the internet. For all the reasons I've given, but also for another, those entities don't touch on the things that matter, that make us human. Neither of those entities, the market or the internet, can tell you anything about birth or death. Neither of them can tell you the first thing about birth or death. And birth or death, if we're going to stay in a tradition which was very important to Havel, are the most fundamental things. If you think your version of rationality has nothing to say about creating and ending life, then it can't possibly have anything to say about freedom. What I would say is that reason and freedom begin elsewhere. They begin with a recognition that we are special, that we can reason in a certain way, that we're alive, that we might die. And the business that we're alive is very important, right? That if we expect reason from entities like the internet or like the market, which aren't alive, we're making a very fundamental kind of mistake. So we're alive, we can reason, and the most important thing, we're unpredictable because we have access to a world where unpredictable things reside. The unpredictable things are the values. If I drop a rock, you know it's going to hit the stage. But if I'm in a dilemma in my life where I have to tell a friend something that that friend needs to know, but it's hard because I want to protect that friend as well. You all understand that I'm in a conflict of values between loyalty and honesty. And you all know loyalty is good. Honesty is also good. And you know there is no mathematical or so-called rational way to decide that question. There is no way that I can say, well, loyalty is better than honesty, therefore loyalty, or honesty is better than loyalty, therefore honesty. The transitive property of mathematics does not apply to values. On the contrary, we have to choose, we have to combine, and we use our reason to come up with not only new choices and new combinations, but also with new values. Many of the things that people quite rightly value now were not values 50 years ago, and many of the things that people will value in 50 years quite rightly are not values now. What Havel called moral standards in his letter to Husak in 1975 are real. Morality is real. It's as real as air or water or earth, but what we can do with it is different than what we can do with air or water and earth. We can work it in ways that are our own and which are unpredictable. And when we work it into the world, we're making the world unpredictable. That's the magic of freedom. We can take this dimension of unpredictability and following our own moral combinations and affirmations, as for example Zelensky did when he stayed in Kiev, we make the world more unpredictable. We ourselves are free, but we also make the world more free. And we do this, hopefully, along with others in what Havel called the hidden life of society. Hopefully we find the zones where our unpredictable personal combinations of what we really, in fact, do care about meet someone else's. And then we do something together which is even more unpredictable than if we were doing it alone. But to complete this thought, I have to go to a place where I do not believe Havel went. And that is back from ideas of unpredictability and freedom and towards ideas of what it would mean to govern, what it would mean to have a state. And that's for two very big reasons. If you've been listening to my description of the world, you've been thinking, well, who on earth or what on earth could deal with these oligarchs? And of course, there was only one practical answer. And I'll give you a hint. It's not more oligarchs. There is only one entity which can deal with the growing power of hydrocarbon and digital oligarchs in our world, and that is the state. That is the government. That is the state. There is no other hope. If your diagnosis is that the oligarchs are the problem, your only answer is going to have to be the state. But the question is, what kind of state, and how does one justify the state? And here I want to make an argument which I believe has to be added to Havel's account of unpredictability and freedom to make it make sense. You don't get to be a playwright or a poet or a bohemian living in a nice village all by yourself. You only get to be that kind of person with the help of others. And it's not just your family and your friends. That's a nice story. But you get to be a playwright or a poet. You get to be someone who publishes books, or to talk, it doesn't have to be Havel, but I'm using Havel. You get to be someone who achieves unique things because of the help of others. And that help of others in a big, complex society like ours has to be organized politically. If you agree with my argument, and I hope you do, then you would agree that we want to have people who are capable of being unpredictable, who are capable of seeing what's going on in the world, who are capable of having their own value commitments and capable of realizing them in new ways. But we are not like that automatically. We are not like that automatically. Nature doesn't make us like that. As Havel said, it makes us capable of being like that. But we're also capable of doing other things, as Havel said, right? And so if we believe that freedom, as I've been trying to claim, is the most important value, because it's the value that enables all of the others, we have to create a society in which people can become free. That then is the justification of freedom for government. because there are many things that we need to become free, like childcare, like obstetrics, like early childhood education, like schools, which we simply cannot do as individuals. So the argument for creating free people ends up justifying certain forms, not all forms, but certain forms of collective action. So what is freedom? Freedom then, in one sense, is highly individual. It's each of us having contact with a moral world in which each of us in different ways draws that moral world into this world and makes this world richer and more beautiful and more interesting. But at the same time, freedom is also a program. One can't be like that or help other people to be like that just by using the right words in a lecture or just by writing a political pamphlet, no matter how good it is. One could only help people to be free by making freedom the basis, the program for a better kind of government. That's where I leave you. Thank you very much. Děkuji moc krát.
Thank you so much, Professor Snyder. Please don't rush away. Not yet, because we've got a tiny surprise for you. And in order to deliver the surprise, let me invite Mr. Jan Lipavský, Minister of Foreign Affairs, to the stage. Minister Lipavský, if you could.
Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Snyder, Mr. Director, friends of the Václav Havel Library, distinguished guests. As the Czech Minister of Foreign Affairs, it's my duty to advocate for our nation's interests on the global stage. Sadly, the world is not in a good state right now, with the rules-based order crumbling under the pressure of aggressive regimes. Diplomacy is more demanding than ever. While navigating our country to turbulent waters, I often turn to the insightful works of Professor Snyder for guidance. My copy of The Road to Unfreedom, which Mr. Professor so kindly signed it for me in New York last year, holds a special place in my bookshelf. Through his writings, Professor Snyder has illustrated how easily dangerous ideologies can lead to the collapse of democracies and the rise of dictatorships. Our region is currently under threat from an aggressive dictator whose imperial ambitions stretch far from beyond Ukraine. Professor Snyder's work reaches millions around the world, shedding light on the ongoing dangers posed by imperialists' aspirations, especially from countries like Russia. It also shows us why and how we should defend freedom and democracy. In the United States and Europe, Professor Snyder has been inspiring us through books, lectures, and articles. For this reason, I wish to thank Professor Snyder his outstanding contribution to public diplomacy. Professor, it's my great honor to present to you with the Distinguished Contribution to Diplomacy Medal. This award is an expression of my thanks and personal admiration for your work.